Good evening. Tonight we begin with something ordinary. So ordinary that it drifted unnoticed through streets, homes, and classrooms for centuries. A pipe. Not a dramatic object, not a weapon or a relic or a symbol of anything terrible. Just a pipe, grey and soft, fitted into the earth beneath a Roman street 2,000 years ago, carrying water from the aqueducts into the homes of people who considered themselves the most civilized human beings who had ever lived. They were not wrong about that in many ways. They were also being slowly poisoned. Not by enemies, not by plague or famine or the chaos of war, by the very infrastructure they had built, by the pride of their engineering, by a metal they had chosen again and again, because it was useful and malleable, and in small ways sweet. And they trusted it the way you trust the walls of your own home or the water from your own tap. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the darker corners of history. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated by the different places that gather here at night. Phone face down, volume low. Take a slow breath. Let's go in. This is the history of lead. Not a story of sudden catastrophe, but of something quieter and stranger. Of a substance so woven into the fabric of human progress that removing it felt, for a very long time, like an act of self-destruction rather than self-preservation. It lined our pipes. It brightened our paint. It flowed through the engines of a century. The air of the 20th century carried traces of it over every continent on Earth. If you were alive in the middle of that century, you breathed it, you absorbed it. Very likely, you never knew. Tonight, we follow this metal from its earliest fires to its final reckoning. And we ask, quietly, the question that runs beneath all of it. What does it mean to be harmed by something you trusted completely? Silence your notifications. Take a slow breath, and let us begin. The first people to work with lead did not know what they were handling. They only knew that it was easy. That is the thing about lead that has always drawn human hands toward it. It is the most cooperative of metals. You can scratch it with a fingernail. You can bend it without heat. Melt it, and it flows at temperatures a simple wood fire can achieve. 450 degrees Celsius, a fraction of what iron or copper requires. Cast it into a mold, let it cool, and it holds its shape with a satisfying, substantial weight. It does not rust. It does not crack. It is, in the parlance of metallurgy, a deeply obliging substance. The oldest known evidence of deliberate lead smelting comes from the region of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and dates to approximately 6,500 years before the Common Era. This was long before the great river civilizations of Mesopotamia had developed writing. Long before the pyramids, the people who first drew lead from galena ore were working by firelight and intuition, following the logic of a material that seemed almost to want to be useful. They were right in a narrow and ultimately tragic sense. Lead was extraordinarily useful, and it was everywhere. Galena, lead sulfide, the ore from which most ancient lead was smelted, is abundant in the Earth's crust and visually distinctive. Heavy metallic gray crystals with a satisfying cubic cleavage that catches the light. Ancient miners in Anatolia, in Spain, in the British Isles, in the hills around Rome, found it without great difficulty. The Roman Empire, at its peak, produced an estimated 80,000 tons of lead per year. a figure that would not be matched again in global production until the Industrial Revolution nearly 16 centuries later. 80,000 tons a year. Think on that for a moment as you settle into the quiet of wherever you are tonight. That is not a small industry. That is a civilization that had consciously and methodically built itself around this substance. The word for lead in Latin was plumbum. You may recognize it. It is the root of the English word plumbing. And also, less obviously, of the chemical symbol Pb that still represents lead on the periodic table today. The connection is not incidental. Roman plumbing was quite literally lead work. The pipes that carried water from the aqueducts into the fountains, the bathhouses, the private homes of wealthy Romans, those pipes were lead, sheet lead, rolled and soldered, running for miles beneath the greatest urban infrastructure the ancient world had ever built. The aqueducts themselves were one of Rome's most celebrated achievements. The Aqua Appia, completed in 312 BC, the Aenio Vetus a generation later, and eventually 11 major aqueducts supplying a city of over 1 million people, with an estimated 800 liters of water per person per day, a volume that would not be matched in any Western city until the 19th century. This was extraordinary engineering. This was, by any measure, civilization. But the water that traveled so elegantly through stone channels and arches arrived, eventually, in lead. The fistulae, the lead distribution pipes, branched out from the main flow and carried it into homes. When soft water sits in contact with lead, even briefly, it dissolves small quantities of metal. The longer the contact, the more it dissolves. The first water drawn in the morning, which had been sitting in the pipes overnight, would have contained the highest concentrations. The rich, as it happened, had first access to the morning's water. This is not an irony. It is a fact recorded in Roman administrative texts. But lead pipes were only one part of the Roman relationship with this metal. They were, in some ways, not even the most intimate part. The Romans cooked with lead. They sweetened their wine with it. Sapa was a Roman culinary staple, a boiled-down concentrate of grape juice, dark and syrupy, used as a preservative, a sweetener, and a flavor enhancer. It was prepared by boiling grape must in large vessels over open fires, reducing it to a thick, almost treacle-like consistency. The ideal vessel for this preparation, as Roman recipes and household guides consistently noted, was lead. Not clay, not bronze, lead. The reason was chemical, though the Romans did not know it in those terms. When grape juice is reduced in a lead pot, the acetic acid in the fruit reacts with the metal and produces lead acetate, a compound with a genuinely, unmistakably sweet taste. The Romans noticed that their supper was sweeter when prepared in lead. They concluded that lead made better supper. They were not wrong about the observation. They were catastrophically wrong about the implication. Lead acetate is a poison. It was used not just in cooking, but in wine production. Roman wines fermented quickly and turned to vinegar without preservatives. Lead-based preparations slowed fermentation, preserved flavor, brightened color, and added that characteristic sweetness. Wine amphorae, the large clay jars in which wine was stored and shipped, were sometimes lined with lead. Wine served at aristocratic tables was often deliberately adulterated with small quantities of lead compounds to improve its taste. Across the Roman Empire, from Britain to North Africa, wine traveled in lead-lined vessels, and the people who drank it most abundantly were the wealthy, the aristocratic classes, the senators, the generals, the emperors themselves. It is worth pausing here in the dark to consider what chronic lead exposure does to a human being. Not the acute poisoning of a lead worker who handles too much of the metal at once, the tremors, the convulsions, the collapse. That kind of poisoning was visible, was sometimes even discussed. The chronic kind is different, slower, quieter. Chronic lead exposure accumulates in the bones, where it mimics calcium and embeds itself into the skeletal structure. It affects the kidneys, gradually impairing their filtering capacity. It damages the peripheral nervous system, causing weakness and a characteristic condition the Romans called colica pictonum, painter's colic. Cramping abdominal pain that appeared in people who worked with lead regularly. Most significantly, lead crosses the blood-brain barrier. It interferes with the transmission of signals between neurons. In adults, this manifests as cognitive dulling, mood disturbances, irritability, what we might today recognize as symptoms adjacent to depression or anxiety. In extreme cases, it produces encephalopathy, brain swelling, confusion, psychosis. In children, whose nervous systems are still developing, the effects are more severe and longer lasting. But Rome was not thinking about children specifically. It was thinking about wine and pipes and the gleaming white cosmetic lead powder that aristocratic women applied to their faces and necks, the cerasa, white lead carbonate. That was the foundation of the fashionable pale complexion of the Roman court. White lead cosmetics had been in use across the Mediterranean since the 4th century BC. Greek women applied them. Roman women refined the practice. The cerasa was mixed with fat and spread across the face and décolletage, giving the skin an alabaster smoothness and the pallor that connoted aristocracy and refinement, a complexion that had never, clearly, worked in the fields. The women who wore it regularly absorbed it through their skin. They inhaled it as fine particles. Some sources suggest they tasted it. Lead acetate, recall, is sweet. There is something deeply melancholy in this. The women of Rome, who wanted to appear beautiful, who followed the standards of their culture, were absorbing a neurotoxin in the service of an aesthetic ideal. The poets praised their paleness. The physicians rarely noted their suffering. Among those physicians, some were more observant than others. Galen, the Greek-born physician who served as personal doctor to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century CE, wrote explicitly that the water transported to Rome through lead pipes was not suitable for drinking. He recommended rainwater for the preparation of medicines. He was not alone. The architect and engineer Vitruvius, writing a century earlier, had observed that workers in lead foundries were pale, weak, and suffered from disordered blood. He recommended that public water should be channeled through clay or stone, rather than lead wherever possible. The Greek physician Nicander, writing in the 2nd century BC, had described what we would recognize today as acute lead poisoning: the abdominal cramping, the gray complexion, the progressive muscular weakness, the eventual paralysis. With clinical precision, they knew. The ancient world knew in fragments and whispers that lead was not entirely safe, and yet the knowledge never accumulated into action. The metal was too useful. The alternatives were too expensive. The symptoms were too slow, too diffuse, too easily attributed to other causes: bad air, excessive wine, the ordinary afflictions of age. And the people with the greatest power to change things were, quite often, the people most thoroughly exposed to the substance. The aristocracy ate from lead-lined vessels. They drank from lead-preserved wines. Their water came through lead pipes. Their wives wore lead cosmetics. Their bodies carried lead in their bones. There is a theory, not proven, not universally accepted, but not dismissed either, that chronic lead exposure contributed in a meaningful way to the mental decline of the Roman ruling class. Historians and toxicologists have debated this for over a century, and the evidence, assembled gradually from skeletal analysis, from the lead isotope records preserved in sediment layers near Portus, the port of Rome, and from the clinical descriptions embedded in ancient texts, suggests at the very least that the Roman aristocracy was exposed to lead concentrations that would, by modern standards, be considered acutely dangerous. Look at the emperors of the 1st and 2nd centuries, A.D. Caligula, who reigned from 37 to 41 CE, and whose behavior, the sexual cruelty, the paranoia, the erratic declarations, the violence, has been interpreted as psychotic by modern historians. Nero, who by contemporary accounts became progressively more irrational, more brutal, more disconnected from ordinary consequence as his reign continued. Commodus, who declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules and spent the end of his reign fighting gladiators in the arena while the empire deteriorated around him. These men were products of their time and circumstance in 100 different ways. Power corrupts. The isolation of absolute authority distorts. There is no need to invoke toxicology to explain political tyranny, but consider quietly what their daily lives contained. The wine sweetened with lead acetate, the water from the lead pipes, the food prepared in lead cookware by slaves who had no idea what they were adding to the pot, and perhaps most intimate of all, the cerusa their mothers had worn while carrying them. Lead in the womb passes to the fetus. It has done so across all of human history in which lead was present. The children of heavily exposed mothers are born already carrying the metal in their bones, in their brains, in the soft tissue of the body that has barely yet learned how to be itself. The Roman Empire fell for many reasons. The borders too wide to defend, the cost of the legions, the migrations of peoples from the east, the structural weight of an administrative system that could not sustain itself indefinitely. Historians will debate the proportions of these causes for as long as there are historians. But somewhere in that long, slow dissolution, in the silences between the recorded battles and the senatorial debates, in the private rooms where emperors aged faster than they should have, and where aristocratic women found themselves unable to carry pregnancies to term, somewhere in all of that, lead was present. It had been present since before Rome was Rome. It would remain present long after Rome was gone. The pipes stayed in the earth when the empire above them crumbled. Some of them are still there, and the uses that Rome had found for this metal, the pipes, the paint, the food preservation, the cosmetics, would be rediscovered and reinvented by every subsequent civilization that came into contact with it. The knowledge of its danger would travel alongside, always secondary, always provisional, always a little too easy to dismiss. Tonight, we are following that thread, from the Roman pipes beneath the Eternal City to the walls of 18th century European houses, where a painter's trembling hands were already telling a story that the industry around him preferred not to hear. We are only just beginning. There is a painting in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, Johannes Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring, though that is not the painting I am thinking of. I am thinking of the walls behind, his subjects, the pale luminous whites that seem almost to radiate their own light, the cream of a linen collar, the grey of a clouded northern sky, seen through a window, the specific quality of stillness that Vermeer achieved in his interiors, that feeling of air held in suspension, of a moment preserved. That luminosity had a source. It was lead white. The pigment made from lead carbonate, known since antiquity as cerussa, and produced by exposing lead sheets to vinegar vapor over weeks or months, was the foundational white of European painting from the Renaissance until the 19th century. There was no substitute. Other whites, chalk, lime white, bone white, were dull by comparison, lacking the density and covering power that lead white possessed. Lead white, mixed into oil, produced the most opaque, the most reflective, the most lasting whites a painter could achieve. It dried quickly. It blended smoothly. It was, in the technical vocabulary of the painter's craft, irreplaceable. And so Vermeer used it, Rembrandt used it, Rubens, Velázquez, Titian, Van Eyck. Every major painter of the European tradition worked with lead white, as a matter of course, grinding it fresh in their studios, mixing it with linseed oil on their palettes, breathing its dust with every day of work. There was an expression in 17th century Europe, a phrase so common it passed into ordinary idiom without anyone pausing to consider what it meant: mad as a painter. Painters were known, in the popular imagination, to be erratic, volatile, prone to melancholy and outbursts of irrationality. The great creative temperament, it was assumed, the price of artistic sensitivity. The real price was neurological damage. Painters absorbed lead through every available route. They breathed the fine powder as they ground their pigments. They touched their brushes to their lips to sharpen the point, a universal habit of the period. They mixed paint with their bare hands. They spent their working lives in small, poorly ventilated studios where lead particles settled on every surface and hung in the air they breathed. The tremor that afflicted many aging painters, the shaking hand, the difficulty controlling the brush in later years, was not metaphor and was not temperament. It was the peripheral neuropathy of chronic lead exposure. Wrist drop, the inability to extend the hand at the wrist, was so characteristic of painters that it acquired its own clinical name, painter's palsy. The colic that afflicted them, the sudden, severe abdominal cramping, was recognized in medical literature as early as the 17th century. The physician Samuel Stockhausen, writing in 1656, described what he called Hütenketze, the affliction of smelter workers, with enough precision to make the connection to lead exposure clear to any subsequent reader. Bernardino Ramazzini, the Italian physician often called the father of occupational medicine, devoted an entire chapter of his 1,700 treatise De Morbis Artificum Diatriba, a systematic study of diseases of workers, to the painters. He described the trembling, the paralysis, the melancholy, the cognitive dulling. He was not speculating, he was observing. But Ramazzini's observation, like Galen's 15 centuries before him, remained contained within the world of medicine. The painters did not stop using lead white because there was nothing else to use, and the people who bought the paintings, who admired the luminous whites, who commissioned the portraits with their precise and gleaming collars, had no reason to think about what the painter had inhaled to achieve that effect. This is a pattern that will repeat itself throughout this story. The knowledge exists, it circulates in a certain world, the world of medicine, of occupational observation, of careful scientific inquiry. and in the broader world, life continues as before. Painting was not the only place lead white was being applied, however. The same pigment that gave Vermeer's interiors their glow was being used from the early modern period onward to paint walls, houses, children's bedrooms, the interiors and exteriors of every building in Europe and later North America that aspired to a clean, bright, finished appearance. Lead paint was extraordinarily durable. It resisted moisture. It dried hard. It did not yellow over time, in the way that oil-based paints without lead pigment often did. It was, for a builder or a homeowner, an obvious choice, and for the manufacturers who sold it, it was an obvious product. There is a particular document worth pausing on tonight. In July of 1904, the American paint manufacturer Sherwin-Williams published an article in its monthly trade publication. The article was not in itself alarming in tone. It was reporting on developments in the European paint industry, specifically on a French expert's assessment of lead-based paints. The French expert's conclusion, as quoted in the Sherwin-Williams publication, was unambiguous. Lead paint was, in his assessment, poisonous in a significant degree, not only to the workers who manufactured and applied it, but to the inhabitants of the houses it coated. Sherwin-Williams noted this, filed it, and continued manufacturing and selling lead paint for the next 70 years. This is not an unusual story. It is, in many ways, the defining story of lead's 20th century history. A history in which the knowledge of harm was present, was documented, was sometimes even published, and was nonetheless insufficient to disrupt an industry that had become, by that point, deeply embedded in the economies and infrastructures of the modern world. In Europe, the movement against lead paint gathered force more quickly than it did in America. By the 1920s, France, Belgium, Austria, and several other European nations had restricted or banned the use of lead paint for interior residential use. An international convention in 1925, signed by a number of nations, formally acknowledged the dangers of lead white in paint and called for its prohibition in domestic spaces. The United States was not a signatory to that convention. The lead industry in America had become one of the country's most profitable sectors, and it had the political connections to match its economic importance. Consider what lead paint meant for the American housing stock of the early 20th century. From roughly 1880 to 1940, the interior walls of almost every American home were painted with lead-based paint. The concentration of lead in those paints was extraordinarily high by the standards that would eventually be established. Sometimes as much as 50% lead by weight in the brightest whites and yellows. The walls of kitchens, the banisters of staircases, the painted surfaces of cribs and windowsills, and the lower portions of walls that small hands touched and small mouths sometimes reached. Children were always the most vulnerable. This is a fact that was understood in isolated instances earlier than the broader history of lead regulation might suggest. As early as 1897, Australian physician J. Lockhart Gibson identified a cluster of childhood lead poisoning cases in Brisbane and traced them to the lead paint that lined the verandas and exterior walls of Queensland homes, surfaces children played against, touched, and ingested through the hand-to-mouth behavior that is simply characteristic of small children. Gibson published his findings. He presented them at medical conferences. He called for the removal of lead from paints used on surfaces accessible to children. Australia banned lead paint in 1914, The United States did not act for another 64 years. The beauty of lead white was not confined to the painted wall. It had never been. Think again of the Roman cerussa, the white lead cosmetic of the aristocratic court. Across the centuries, the practice of applying white lead to the face had not disappeared. It had merely changed its cultural context. In Elizabethan England, a pale complexion was the height of fashion, and the cerusse, white lead dissolved in vinegar and applied as a foundation, was the most reliable means of achieving it. Queen Elizabeth I wore it. Her courtiers wore it. The portraits of the period, those flat, luminous faces staring out from dark backgrounds, were painted by artists who understood, because they worked with the same material, exactly what the white foundation on their subjects' faces was made of. Elizabeth's cerusse portrait, painted late in her reign, shows a face that contemporaries described as mask-like. The white so thick, the applications so heavy, that expressions were effectively concealed. This was partly fashion and partly practical concealment of smallpox scarring, but the long-term application of white lead to the skin corroded it. Lead carbonate reacted with the natural secretions of the skin and over years damaged the outer layers, causing the very blemishes and uneven tones it was meant to conceal. The response was to apply more. The skin grew worse. The cerusse was applied more thickly. It was a cycle with only one direction of travel. Women who used white lead cosmetics regularly developed, over time, a grey cast to their skin, a brittleness to their hair and nails, a fatigue that contemporaries attributed to the general fragility of the female constitution. Some developed more acute symptoms: the abdominal, cramping, the muscular weakness, the cognitive dulling, and died young, their deaths attributed to the ordinary hazards of Elizabethan life. The connection to their cosmetics was rarely made. It is made now, looking back. But looking back is a luxury. Those who lived within the world did not have the vantage point. They had the fashions and the habits and the materials available to them, and they made the choices those circumstances allowed. This is not an exculpatory observation. It is simply a true one. The women who applied white lead to their faces were not foolish. They were participating in the aesthetic and social logic of their time, just as the Roman women before them had been, just as the painters who licked their brushes were following the habits of their trade. What changed slowly and unevenly over the centuries was the accumulation of testimony, the shaking hands of too many painters, the children in Brisbane hospitals, the articles in European medical journals, the convention that the United States declined to sign. By the time the 20th century arrived, lead was embedded in the walls of the modern world in a quite literal sense. It was in the white paint on the nursery wall. It was in the yellow paint on the front door. It was in the pigment of the ceramic tiles in the kitchen. And it was about to enter the one domain where its reach would be truly global: the air itself. That story begins in December of 1921, in a laboratory in Dayton, Ohio, where a chemical engineer named Thomas Midgley was looking for a way to make a car engine run more smoothly. He found one. What he found alongside it would take another 50 years to fully understand. The problem was a sound, a faint, rapid knock, a pinging, a metallic stuttering that occurred inside the cylinders of early automobile engines when the fuel-air mixture ignited at the wrong moment. Premature ignition. The technical term was engine knock or detonation, and in the early years of the automobile, it was ubiquitous, unavoidable, and deeply frustrating to the engineers tasked with building engines powerful enough to carry the ambitions of a new century. The quality of petrol in the 1910s was poor by modern standards. Refining methods were rudimentary, and the fuel that came from those early processes burned unevenly, causing the knock that damaged engines and reduced their efficiency. The automobile industry was young and growing fast, and the companies at the center of it, General Motors above all, needed a solution, not a theoretical solution, not one that might work in 5 years with further investment. A solution now, reliable and cheap enough to implement at industrial scale, capable of being sold to petrol stations and refineries across the country before a competitor found it first. Charles Kettering, Vice President of Research at General Motors, assigned the problem to a young engineer in his Dayton laboratory. His name was Thomas Midgley Jr. He was 32 years old, trained in mechanical engineering at Cornell University, possessed of a restless and inventive intelligence, and by multiple accounts of those who worked with him, a man who was very good at finding uses for known substances. He carried a copy of the periodic table with him at most times as a kind of portable tool. He had been searching for an anti-knock additive for several years, testing compound after compound, iodine, aniline, camphor, and at one point, somewhat desperately, melted butter, before turning his attention to the periodic table with renewed focus. He screened more than 30,000 compounds in total. Some worked partially. None worked well enough. Then he came to lead. On December the 9th, 1921, Midgley added a small quantity of tetraethyl lead to the fuel in a single-cylinder test engine and started it. The knock was gone. The engine ran smoothly, quietly, with a power and efficiency that the untreated fuel had not produced. The solution was lead. What followed that discovery was not celebration exactly. It was something more deliberate. Tetraethyl lead, TEL as it was abbreviated, was extraordinarily toxic. This was not a surprise to anyone involved. The dangers of lead had been documented for centuries, and the specific dangers of organolead compounds, lead bonded to carbon as in TEL, were known to be more acute than those of inorganic lead salts. TEL enters the body easily through the skin. It evaporates at room temperature into vapor that the lungs absorb with terrible efficiency. Midgley himself, within months of beginning his work with the substance, had to take an extended leave of absence because, as he wrote to a colleague, his lungs had been affected and he needed a large supply of fresh air. He knew what it was. General Motors and Standard Oil of New Jersey, which had joined forces to commercialize the discovery, knew what it was. They proceeded anyway. The name they chose for their product tells you something important about how they intended to manage what they knew. They called it ethyl, not lead, not tetraethyl lead, not anything that connected the smooth-running engine fuel to the substance that had been poisoning painters and pipe workers and cosmetic users for the better part of 2,000 years. Ethyl, a chemical prefix without history, without weight, without the freight of association that the word lead carried even then. The Ethyl Gasoline Corporation was established in 1924, a joint venture between General Motors and Standard Oil, specifically to produce and market TEL. In their materials, their advertisements, their technical bulletins, their communications with petrol distributors, the word lead was absent. The danger was present, but it was internal, confined to memoranda. The advertising that appeared in newspapers and on roadside signage showed clean engines, powerful cars, the gleaming promise of modern motoring. It showed nothing of what was entering the air behind the exhaust pipe. The workers in the factories were less fortunate. In October of 1924, at the Standard Oil Refinery in Bayway, New Jersey, the TEL production plant experienced what the press would later describe as an outbreak of loony gas. Workers began collapsing. Some suffered violent convulsions on the factory floor. Others became acutely psychotic, hallucinating, shouting, unable to recognize their colleagues. One man tore his own restraints loose in the hospital and had to be physically subdued by 3 nurses. Another patient, according to a hospital report of the period, became violently maniacal, leaping from his bed and smashing furniture as though in the grip of a delirium. Within days, 5 workers were dead. 35 more were hospitalized with symptoms ranging from severe neurological damage to what contemporaries described simply as madness. The workers had named TEL themselves loony gas. They were not wrong. The incident made the newspapers. It was not possible to keep it quiet. Too many workers, too visible a crisis, too close to the densely populated environs of New Jersey. Journalists arrived, questions were asked, and General Motors sent Thomas Midgley to a press conference. What Midgley did at that press conference has been described in retrospect as one of the most consequential acts of industrial misdirection in the history of public health. He stood before the assembled journalists and he poured tetraethyl lead over his bare hands. He held a bottle of the compound beneath his nose and inhaled its vapor for 60 seconds. He spoke calmly throughout. He said that he could do this every day without experiencing any health problems whatsoever. He said the risks were manageable. He said the concern was overblown. Within a year, Midgley had to seek medical treatment for lead poisoning. But the damage to public perception, to the regulatory conversation, to the possibility of decisive early action had been done. The press conference worked not because it was convincing necessarily, but because it gave politicians and regulators a reason to hesitate, to wait, to commission another study. In the political and industrial climate of 1924, hesitation and further study were all the industry needed. The studies were duly commissioned. A federal inquiry was convened in 1925 under the auspices of the United States Public Health Service. Yale University physiologist Yandell Henderson testified that 30 tons of lead would fall onto New York's Fifth Avenue every year if leaded petrol became the standard fuel. He described it as a public health catastrophe waiting to happen. Alice Hamilton, a physician at Harvard Medical School who had spent decades documenting the effects of industrial lead on workers, testified to the same effect. Their evidence was coherent, medically grounded, and directly relevant. The industry representatives led by Midgley said there were no alternatives. This was false. Midgley and his team had considered ethanol, ordinary alcohol, as an anti-knock agent early in their research. Ethanol worked. It was cheap to produce. It was readily available, capable of being manufactured from agricultural crops on a large scale, without complex industrial chemistry. It was not patentable, which meant that any petrol company could add it to fuel without paying General Motors a licensing fee. That was precisely why it was not chosen. The profit motive was not incidental to the decision. It was the decision. The choice of TEL over ethanol was not a technical necessity. It was an economic preference dressed as one. The 1926 Surgeon General's Committee released its report. It concluded that there was no real evidence that the public sale of leaded petrol was hazardous to human health. It recommended further study. It did not recommend a ban. Leaded petrol went on sale nationally and then internationally. Within a decade, 80% of American petrol contained tetraethyl lead. Within 2 decades, it was the global standard. The Ethyl Corporation expanded its reach into Europe, into South America, into Asia. Refineries were built on every continent. The car became the definitive technology of the 20th century, and the car ran on lead. Consider the arithmetic of what this meant. Tetraethyl lead does not stay in the engine. After combustion, it is expelled in the exhaust. It leaves the tailpipe as lead oxide particles, microscopic, light enough to remain suspended in air for hours, small enough to pass through the body's respiratory defenses and enter the bloodstream directly through the lungs. In every city, on every highway, around every school, built adjacent to a busy road, these particles settled. They settled on pavements and soil. They settled on the leaves of vegetables grown in urban gardens. They settled on windowsills and in the dust of carpets and into the soft, unresisting tissue of lungs still in the process of growing. They settled, most significantly, into the lungs of children whose bodies absorb lead at a far higher rate than adults and whose developing nervous systems are correspondingly more vulnerable to its effects. Between 1926 and the early 1970s, nearly 50 years, this happened every single day, in every country where automobiles were driven, which was, by mid-century, most of the world. Estimates produced decades later by researchers attempting to reconstruct the environmental lead burden of the mid-20th century suggest that somewhere between 15 million and 20 million tons of lead were released into the Earth's atmosphere through vehicle exhaust over the course of the leaded petrol era. Not tons in a single incident, not tons in a single country. 15 to 20 million tons dispersed, particle by particle, breath by breath, into the air of every city and town and country road on the inhabited surface of the planet. The economists and engineers of the period were not unaware that burning lead compounds in engine exhaust and releasing them into urban air might have consequences. Some of them simply did not consider the consequences their responsibility. Others actively worked to discredit the researchers who were beginning to demonstrate what those consequences looked like. The lead industry, the Ethyl Corporation, the Lead Industries Association, and the companies whose livelihoods depended on the continued sale of TEL, developed over the decades of leaded petrol's dominance a sophisticated and well-funded infrastructure for the management of scientific doubt. When researchers published findings that suggested environmental lead was accumulating in dangerous quantities, the industry funded counter-research. When physicians raised concerns about children's health, the industry questioned their methodology. When regulatory agencies proposed restrictions, the industry mobilized its legal resources and its political connections. This is not unique to lead. It is a pattern that students of industrial history will recognize across multiple substances and multiple eras. But it is worth naming clearly, because the gap between the first documented concern and the eventual regulatory action is not accidental. That gap, in the case of leaded petrol, roughly 50 years, was manufactured. It was the product of deliberate effort, of meetings held and studies funded and testimonies arranged, of the careful, patient maintenance of uncertainty in the minds of the people who might otherwise have acted. The workers at Bayway called it loony gas because they saw, with their own eyes and their own bodies, what it did. They were not subtle about it. The men who hallucinated in the factory, who convulsed on the floor, who died in the hospital in October 1924, they knew. Their bodies carried the knowledge in a form that no corporate memorandum could redact. The question of what everyone else knew and when, and what they chose to do with that knowledge, is the question that runs through the rest of this story. In 1924, the same year as the Bayway disaster, a young man who would one day answer that question definitively was 2 years old, living with his family in Mitchellville, Iowa. His name was Clair Patterson. He was not yet thinking about lead. He would not think about lead for another quarter century. But when he finally did, what he found in the ice and the ocean sediments and the ancient bones of Peruvian peoples would be so disturbing, so comprehensive and meticulous in its implications that the industry he was effectively indicting would spend 20 years trying to silence him. He was not silenced, and what he discovered changed in a quiet but consequential way the air that the children of the late 20th century would breathe. But we are not there yet. Before Patterson, there were the walls, and inside the walls, in the old housing stock of 100 American cities, the lead that had been painted so carefully over so many decades was beginning to age. The paint was beginning to crack. The dust it produced was beginning to settle. And in the houses where that dust settled, children were playing on the floor. He was not trying to save the world. He was trying to find out how old it was. That is where Clair Cameron Patterson's story begins. Not with lead, not with contamination, not with the decades-long fight that would define the second half of his life. It begins with a meteorite and a mass spectrometer, and a problem so apparently straightforward that his advisor at the University of Chicago had described the whole project as, in his words, duck soup. Simple, a matter of measurement, a question with a clear and answerable form. The question was this: how old is the Earth? Scientists in the late 1940s understood that radioactive elements decay at known and constant rates. Uranium-238, for instance, decays into lead-206 at a rate that can be measured precisely. If you take a sample of ancient rock and measure the ratio of uranium to lead within it, you can calculate how long the decay process has been running, which tells you how old the rock is. Apply the same principle to the oldest available material in the solar system, and you can approximate the age of the Earth itself. The oldest available material was meteorites. Iron meteorites, in particular, had formed at the same moment as the planets, 4.5 billion years ago, and had remained largely unchanged since. They were, in effect, clocks that had been set at the creation of the solar system and had been ticking ever since without being reset by the geological processes, erosion, volcanism, tectonic movement, that had continually reworked the surface of the Earth. Measure the lead isotopes in the right meteorite, compare them against the lead in ancient terrestrial rock, and the mathematics would yield the age of the solar system with an accuracy no previous method had achieved. The meteorite Patterson was working with had been recovered from Diablo Canyon in Arizona. He called it the Canyon Diablo meteorite, and he arrived at the University of Chicago prepared to perform what his advisor had suggested was a straightforward series of measurements. It was not straightforward. Lead was everywhere. not in the meteorite itself, or not only there. Lead was in the laboratory air, in the distilled water used to prepare chemical solutions, in the glassware, in the reagents shipped from commercial suppliers, in the surfaces of the workbenches, in the dust that settled from the ventilation system, in, as Patterson would later discover, with something approaching disbelief, his own hair. Every surface in the old university laboratory building was contaminated with traces of lead, and those traces, invisible, undetectable without sensitive analysis, were corrupting his measurements. His lead blanks, the control samples that were supposed to contain no lead at all, contained lead. His data was skewed. His calculations would not resolve. For a less determined scientist, this might have been the end of the project. Patterson was not a less determined scientist. He began rebuilding his laboratory from first principles. He understood that to measure lead accurately at the concentrations present in meteorites and ancient rock, he needed to eliminate every external source of contamination. This meant designing and constructing a laboratory environment unlike anything that had previously existed in scientific research. Filtered air, acid-cleaned glassware, redistilled solvents, surfaces that could be kept scrupulously free of the particulate lead that, as he was slowly coming to understand, permeated the ordinary atmosphere of a mid-20th century building with remarkable thoroughness. He was building, in effect, what would later be recognized as one of the first research clean rooms in the history of science, a space sealed against the ordinary contaminated world outside it, where measurements could be made with a precision that the ordinary world simply did not permit. It took years. The project that had been described as duck soup occupied Patterson for the better part of a decade, much of it spent developing the analytical techniques and the physical infrastructure that the measurements required. He followed his advisor Harrison Brown to the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena in 1952, bringing the project with him, and in 1953 he finally obtained the mass spectrometer data he needed. In 1956, Clair Patterson published the answer. The Earth was 4,550,000,000 years old, 4.55 billion years, give or take 70 million. It was the most accurate determination of the Earth's age that science had yet produced, and it has remained, in its essential figure, unchallenged ever since. It was an extraordinary achievement, one that would, in a more straightforward life, have defined Patterson's entire career. But the clean room had shown him something else, something that, once seen, could not be ignored. In the years he had spent controlling for lead contamination in his laboratory, Patterson had become perhaps the most knowledgeable person in the world on the subject of environmental lead levels and their precise measurement. He had learned to detect lead at concentrations so small they were essentially invisible to conventional analysis. And in the process of learning that, he had been confronted repeatedly with the disturbing and utterly consistent observation. The lead he was controlling for, the contamination he was working so hard to exclude from his samples, was not an anomaly specific to his laboratory. It was everywhere, in the air of every ordinary building, in the water of the municipal supply, in the food he ate, in his own body. This was, on the face of it, unremarkable. Lead is a naturally occurring element. It exists in the Earth's crust, in rock and soil, in trace quantities in water and food. Some amount of environmental lead is simply natural background. The ordinary presence of a metal distributed through the geological substrate of the planet. But Patterson was a geochemist who had just spent years measuring lead at extremely low concentrations, and what he was finding did not look like natural background. It looked like something imposed, something added. The levels were too high, too uniform across too many samples, too closely correlated with the infrastructure of modern industrial life. He began measuring lead in ocean water, in ocean sediments layered over centuries, in ancient human bones exhumed from archaeological sites. And in 1964 and 1965, in a project that would prove to be the turning point of his scientific life, he obtained ice core samples from Camp Century in Greenland and from Antarctica, ice laid down over thousands of years, preserving the atmospheric conditions of each era in which it had formed, like the pages of a book written by the sky itself. The ice cores carried, locked in their crystalline layers, an unbroken record of what the atmosphere had contained year by year across the span of human history. Ice from the depths, from centuries and millennia before industrialization, could be extracted, melted, and its lead content measured with the precision Patterson had spent a decade developing. Then the same could be done for ice from more recent layers, moving upward toward the surface, forward in time through the Industrial Revolution and into the 20th century. The results were unambiguous, and to Patterson, they were alarming. Ice from the pre-industrial era contained lead at barely detectable levels, vanishingly small, consistent with the natural background of a world in which lead use was minimal and localized, some ancient smelting, some Roman-era production, but nothing approaching the scale of what was to come. Ice from the 20th century told a completely different story, beginning in the 1920s. Precisely when tetraethyl lead had been introduced into automobile fuel on a large scale and distributed globally, the lead concentration in the atmospheric record shot upward, not gradually, not in the slow, ambiguous way of a natural geochemical cycle unfolding over millennia, sharply, steeply, in a pattern that matched, with uncomfortable precision, the timeline of the worldwide expansion of leaded petrol. Patterson studied the bones of Peruvian people who had died around 1,600 years ago, before the industrial era, before leaded petrol, before the great expansion of lead smelting that had accompanied the Industrial Revolution. He measured the lead in their skeletal remains with the same rigorous methodology he had applied to the meteorite samples. Then he compared that figure to the lead concentration in the bodies of contemporary Americans, measured from blood samples and from the bones of people who had died in the mid-20th century. The difference was staggering. Contemporary Americans were carrying somewhere between 500 and 1,000 times more lead in their bodies than the ancient Peruvians. In his 1965 paper, published in the Archives of Environmental Health under the title Contaminated and Natural Lead, Environments of Man, Patterson laid out his findings with the precision of a man who understood that every number would be scrutinized. He was careful in his language. He was also unsparing in his conclusions. He calculated that the average American in 1965 was absorbing somewhere between 300 and 500 micrograms of lead per day, primarily from food, water, and air contaminated by industrial and automotive sources. The natural human intake before industrialization had been approximately 1 to 2 micrograms per day. He estimated that contemporary Americans were carrying blood lead levels roughly 100 times higher than the natural human baseline. and those levels were within approximately a factor of 2 of the threshold at which the medical literature of the time acknowledged that symptoms of lead poisoning became clinically apparent. In other words, ordinary Americans in 1965, going about their ordinary lives, were absorbing enough lead to hover at what Patterson calculated was just below the line at which the body begins to show recognizable signs of damage. Not poisoned in the acute, dramatic sense, not convulsing on the floor of a factory in New Jersey, but not untouched either, chronically, quietly, invisibly burdened with a metal that had no business being in the human body in those concentrations, and that had been shown going back to the ancient physicians to affect the nervous system in ways both dramatic and subtle. He phrased it with the directness of a man who had spent a decade learning to speak very carefully about very precise measurements. The average resident of the United States is being subjected to severe chronic lead insult. The response from the lead industry was swift and total. The Ethyl Corporation, whose existence depended on the continued sale of tetraethyl lead, understood immediately what Patterson's paper represented. Not merely a scientific contribution to be considered and refined through the ordinary processes of peer review. An existential threat, in the economic sense, from a scientist at one of the most prestigious research universities in the country, whose methodology was impeccable and whose data had been gathered with a rigor that made it extremely difficult to dismiss on technical grounds. So they did not try to dismiss it on technical grounds. They attacked Patterson. Industry representatives contacted Caltech and raised questions about whether Patterson's research was an appropriate use of university resources. Research organizations that had previously supported aspects of his work quietly withdrew their funding. When the National Research Council convened a panel on atmospheric lead contamination, in 1971, Patterson was explicitly excluded from it. Excluded from the very panel examining the subject his research had defined and documented more comprehensively than any other scientist alive. His colleagues received calls from industry representatives suggesting, without always saying directly, that associating with Patterson's work might not be advantageous to their own funding prospects. For a man who had already spent a decade in a clean room, working in deliberate and meticulous isolation from the contaminated world outside it, this kind of professional isolation was perhaps not entirely without precedent, but it was wounding. He had published his findings in good faith through legitimate scientific channels, and the response had not been refutation, not the production of contradictory data, not the identification of genuine methodological flaws. It was the grinding institutional pressure of organizations with money and political connections applying that money and those connections in the direction they had always applied them when the evidence turned inconvenient. Patterson continued anyway. He did not have, it seems, the particular variety of prudence that might have counseled a quieter life. He testified before Congress. He wrote to governors. He corresponded with environmental advocates and with public health officials who were beginning, tentatively, to take the emerging evidence seriously. He refined his measurements, extended his data across new samples and new time periods, and deepened his analysis of what the ice cores and the ocean sediments and the ancient bones were collectively saying. He was, by multiple accounts of the people who knew him well, not naturally a political or public figure. He had trained as a scientist, had spent his formative professional years in a room sealed against the ordinary world, and had never anticipated that his work would require him to become something else. An advocate, an activist, a man who read environmental legislation and attended regulatory hearings and argued year after year against the interlocking interests of the petroleum and lead industries. He did not stop, and slowly the world began to change around him. The Clean Air Act of 1970, driven by the broader environmental movement of that decade, by the visible, undeniable damage of burning rivers and photochemical smog and dying lakes, authorized the development of national air quality standards that would eventually provide the regulatory framework for addressing leaded petrol at scale. In 1973, the Environmental Protection Agency issued its first regulation acknowledging that lead particle emissions from automobiles presented a significant risk to the health of urban populations, particularly children. The phase-out had begun. It was slow. Every step was contested. The lead industry mobilized its lawyers and its lobbyists at every regulatory juncture. But the direction of travel had been established, and the evidence that Patterson had spent 20 years assembling and defending was at its foundation. By 1976, the EPA reported that more than 100,000 tons of lead were being added to American petrol every single month. The scale of the contamination he had described in 1965 was not theoretical. It was a documented, ongoing, measurable fact, confirmed by blood lead surveys that had begun in the mid-1970s and that showed exactly what Patterson had predicted. The blood of ordinary Americans was carrying levels of lead that had no natural precedent. The EPA required reductions. The monthly figure dropped below 50,000 tons by 1980, and as the lead came out of the petrol, something happened in the bodies of Americans. Something clean and undeniable. Blood lead levels fell. Between 1976 and 1991, as the phase-out gathered pace, the average blood lead level of Americans dropped by approximately 78%. 78%. This is one of the most direct and verifiable demonstrations of environmental cause and effect in the history of public health. Lead entered the petrol, lead entered the air, lead entered the bodies of the people who breathed that air. Lead was removed from the petrol, lead left the air. Lead levels dropped in the bodies of the people who now breathed something closer to what Patterson had calculated from his ice cores and his ancient bones as a natural baseline. The mechanism was not ambiguous. It was not hidden behind layers of confounding variables or disputed statistical methodology. It was visible, quantifiable, measurable in the blood of children year on year. Patterson received the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement in 1995. He died that same year, at the age of 73, having seen the United States complete the prohibition on leaded petrol for road vehicles the previous year. He did not live to see Algeria ban it in 2021, the last country on earth to do so. But the work he had done, begun in frustration over a contaminated meteorite sample in a Chicago laboratory sometime around 1948, had reached its conclusion. The air is cleaner than it was. Not entirely clean. The lead that was deposited over 50 years in the soil of roadsides and urban gardens does not simply disappear. It remains. It will remain for decades more, slowly dispersing into forms less bioavailable, less immediately dangerous, but still present in the earth beneath the cities, where a generation of children grew up in the years when the air above those streets carried something extra. Clair Patterson did not set out to find any of this. He set out to find a number. He found it. And then, in the obsessive, thorough way of a scientist who cannot leave a discrepancy unresolved, he found what the number implied. And he spent the rest of his life making sure that what he had found could not be ignored. It could not. But the petrol was only part of the story. In the walls of every home built before 1978, the paint was still there, cracking, chalking, settling into the dust of the floors where children played. That part of the story belongs to a pediatrician in Pittsburgh who would begin in the late 1970s to look very carefully at the blood of urban children and find what he found there both predictable and devastating. Lead acetate is sweet. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a detail included for effect. It is a chemical fact, one that has been documented since Roman antiquity, when the substance was used to sweeten wine and preserve grape concentrates in lead vessels. Lead acetate, the compound formed when lead reacts with acetic acid, tastes unmistakably and genuinely sweet. In some historical accounts, it was called sugar of lead. It was used as a flavoring. It was used as a medicine. Its sweetness was considered one of its notable properties. A child in a pre-1978 American home, living in a house whose walls had been painted many times over with lead-based paint, would encounter lead primarily as dust. Dry, chalky paint dust, invisible in ordinary light, settling on floors and windowsills and the tops of baseboards, settling on toys left near the walls, settling on the hands of children who touched those surfaces, and then, in the ordinary and unremarkable way of small children, put those hands to their mouths. The dust was sweet, not overwhelmingly, not obviously, but faintly, persistently sweet in the way that makes a small child return to a thing without quite knowing why. It tasted in a diffuse and indistinct way, like something that was not entirely unpleasant. This detail is almost unbearable to sit with. But it is true. The homes most affected were the oldest. Housing stock built before 1940. Housing concentrated in the inner cities of the American Northeast and Midwest, in the densely packed streets of Baltimore and Boston and Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit, contained the highest concentrations of lead paint, applied in layers over decades, sometimes over a century. Paint that had been baked by summer heat and contracted by winter cold, year after year, until its surface had become a fine chalky powder. Paint that flaked from window frames when windows were raised and lowered, generating lead dust with every ordinary domestic motion. The children who lived in these houses were disproportionately poor. They were disproportionately black. The history of American housing policy, redlining, restricted covenants, the systematic exclusion of black families from the new suburban developments of the post-war era, where the housing was newer and the paint was more recent, had concentrated the oldest, most heavily leaded housing in the communities that had the least political power and the fewest resources to demand remediation. This is not an incidental detail in the story of childhood lead poisoning in America. It is the central context without which the full shape of the story cannot be understood. By the 1950s and 1960s, pediatricians and public health officials in certain American cities had begun to notice patterns that they found deeply troubling. Children admitted to hospital with acute symptoms, convulsions, encephalopathy, coma, were often found to have extraordinary levels of lead in their blood. Investigation of the homes these Children came from revealed peeling, flaking lead paint in every case. The connection was not obscure to the physicians who looked carefully. The city of Baltimore, as early as the 1930s, had documented the widespread hazard of lead paint in its aging housing stock and taken some limited steps toward controlling it. The knowledge again existed. The action was slow, partial, and perpetually insufficient. The acute cases were dramatic and visible. They were the ones that generated hospital admissions and medical reports. But they represented only the most extreme end of a spectrum of exposure that stretched much further. Most children who were absorbing dangerous amounts of lead did not convulse. They did not lose consciousness. They did not display symptoms that their parents or teachers or physicians would recognize as symptoms of poisoning at all. They were, in the clinical language of the period, asymptomatic. Lead poisoning is, for the most part, a silent condition. Its damage is not announced. It accumulates quietly in bone and tissue and neural structure. And its effects manifest not as a medical crisis, but as a slightly flattened developmental trajectory. A small reduction in attention, a modest difficulty with reading, a fractional diminishment of the speed and flexibility of thought that, distributed across thousands or millions of children, translates into something significant, but that in any individual child is essentially invisible, easily attributed to 100 other factors. This invisibility was, in a practical sense, the industry's greatest protection. You cannot easily point to a child and say, "This child would have been different without the lead." The child does not know what they would have been. The parents do not know. The teacher noting the slightly slow reading or the difficulty sustaining attention does not know. The damage is real, but it is counterfactual. It exists in the gap between what was and what might have been, and that gap, by its nature, cannot be directly observed. Herbert Needleman understood this, and he spent the better part of a decade designing a study that could make the invisible visible. Needleman was a paediatrician at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh and later a professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. He had been thinking about the effects of low-level lead exposure on children since the late 1960s, and he had become increasingly persuaded that the medical community's existing framework, which focused primarily on the dramatic acute cases and which defined lead poisoning by a blood lead threshold that corresponded to clinical symptoms, was missing something important. The damage was not confined to the children sick enough to go to hospital. It extended, in subtler form, much further down the exposure curve. The challenge was finding a way to measure something that, by definition, produced no obvious symptoms. He needed a population of children, a way to stratify them by lead exposure, and a way to measure their cognitive function with sufficient precision to detect differences that might be quite small in any individual case, but meaningful across a large group. He found his measure of exposure in teeth. Shed baby teeth, the first teeth lost in the ordinary course of childhood development, absorb lead in proportion to the child's lead exposure during the period of the tooth's formation. They are, in effect, biological records of the lead burden a child carried during their earliest years. Needleman collected shed teeth from first and second grade school children in two Massachusetts school systems, Chelsea and Somerville, and measured the lead content of each tooth with the same kind of rigorous analytical methodology that Clair Patterson had spent years developing on the other side of the country. He divided the children into groups based on their tooth lead levels, high exposure and low exposure, and then, administered a battery of neuropsychological tests, IQ assessments, tests of attention, language processing, fine motor function, the capacity to follow sequences of instruction. He also gathered information from teachers who rated each child on behavioral dimensions, distractibility, ability to stay on task, organizational capacity, without knowing which group the child belonged to. The results, published in 1979 in the New England Journal of Medicine, were the most direct and statistically robust demonstration of low-level leads' cognitive effects that had yet appeared in the scientific literature. Needleman had examined 3,329 children in total, retaining 2,146 whose tooth lead measurements met his quality criteria. He had cross-referenced the lead data against school records, teacher evaluations, and neuropsychological test results gathered without the examiners knowing the lead status of the child they were assessing. It was, by the standards of epidemiology, well-designed study, rigorous in its controls, careful in its documentation, and resistant to the kinds of methodological criticisms that might otherwise provide a foothold for dismissal. Children in the high lead exposure group scored, on average, 4 IQ points lower than children in the low exposure group, 4 points. This may sound modest in the context of an individual child. In the context of a population, a 4-point average reduction in IQ is not modest at all. It shifts the entire distribution of cognitive outcomes, reducing the proportion of the population in the highest functioning range, while increasing the proportion in the range associated with learning difficulties. Across a city, across a nation, across a generation of children growing up in houses with lead paint and breathing air thickened with lead from vehicle exhausts, the cumulative effect of a 4-point average reduction is a very large number of people living with diminished cognitive capacities that they and everyone around them will simply have come to accept as normal. Furthermore, urban children in traffic-heavy environments had blood lead levels up to 5 times higher than children in leafy suburban areas. The geography of the damage followed the geography of poverty and density. The children most exposed were the children least equipped, institutionally and economically, to advocate for their own remediation. The teachers' ratings confirmed the IQ data and in some ways amplified it. The high lead children were significantly more likely to be rated by their teachers as distractible, as having difficulty following instructions, as exhibiting behavior consistent with what would later be codified as attention deficit disorders. They were more likely to have repeated a grade. They were more likely to have been referred for remedial services. Again, not dramatically different in any individual case, but consistently, significantly different at the population level. Needleman was careful, thorough, and methodologically rigorous. He knew his findings would be contested, and he prepared his data accordingly. He was right that they would be contested, but the nature of the contestation that followed was not the ordinary scientific process of replication and critique. It was a sustained campaign by the lead industry and its allies to destroy not just Needleman's findings, but Needleman himself. The Lead Industries Association and its affiliated organizations funded counter-research. They identified sympathetic academics willing to publish critiques of Needleman's methodology. They lobbied Congress to delay or prevent regulatory action on leaded petrol and lead paint. And in the early 1990s, 2 university researchers, one of whom had been hired as an expert witness by Lead Smelting Company involved in a waste disposal lawsuit, formally requested access to Needleman's raw data, ostensibly to audit his statistical analysis. They subsequently published a critique that accused him of scientific misconduct, alleging selective use of data and methodological irregularities in his original study. The accusation of scientific misconduct, regardless of its merits, triggered a formal institutional investigation. For 2 years, Needleman was under inquiry. His career was suspended in a kind of professional limbo while the investigation ran its course. The lead industry, it seemed, understood very well that the most efficient way to manage an inconvenient piece of science was not to refute it, but to make its author's credibility a matter of ongoing institutional dispute. The investigation concluded that Needleman had not committed scientific misconduct. His data were sound. His methodology was defensible. The critique against him had been, the investigators found, itself methodologically flawed. Needleman was cleared, and he returned to his research. His findings, in the years that followed, were replicated and extended by researchers around the world. The dose-response relationship between lead exposure and cognitive outcomes in children became one of the most thoroughly documented findings in environmental health science. The research was not contested in the peer-reviewed literature in any sustained or credible way. It was contested in the political and legal arena, where the standards of evidence and the incentives of the participants are quite different from those of science. The 1978 ban on lead paint in residential buildings, the regulation that Australia had implemented in 1914, that several European countries had enacted in the 1920s, that the International Convention of 1925 had called for, and that the United States had finally arrived at 64 years after the first clear documentation of the hazard, addressed the new production of residential lead paint. It did not address the paint already on the walls. The distance between those two things, banning new paint and removing old paint, is the distance between a symbolic acknowledgement and an actual intervention. It is the distance between saying a thing is harmful and doing the work required to remove it from the places where it is causing harm. That distance, in the case of American lead paint policy, would stretch across decades and would never fully close. The paint stayed. The children kept arriving in those houses. The dust kept settling. Consider what this means in human terms. A family moves into a house built in 1930 in a Midwestern city. The walls have been painted 8 or 10 times since then. The most recent coat of paint may be from the 1980s, well after the ban. But beneath it, layer after layer, is the original paint with its extraordinarily high lead concentration. When the walls crack at the corners, when the window frame is forced too hard, when the summer heat causes the old layers to bubble and peel, the lead from those original coats enters the living space. It enters the dust, it enters the hands of every child who plays on the floor of that room. The family does not know. There is no visible sign. There is no smell. There is nothing to indicate, in the ordinary experience of living in that house, that something is being transferred from the walls into the bodies of the children who are growing up inside them. In 1978, when the Consumer Product Safety Commission's regulations took effect, there were approximately 57 million housing units in the United States that had been built before 1980. Of those, somewhere between 38 and 57 million, estimates varied depending on the threshold used to define lead paint, contained lead-based paint somewhere within their structure. Most homes built before 1960 had paint with very high lead concentrations. Homes built between 1960 and 1978 had somewhat lower concentrations, as the industry had voluntarily reduced lead content in the preceding decades. But they were not lead-free. The ban meant no new lead paint would go on residential walls after 1978. It did not mean the old paint would be removed. It would not be removed, not systematically, not with the urgency that the data, by the late 1970s, clearly justified. The remediation of lead paint hazards in older housing required money, political will, and a housing policy infrastructure capable of acting at scale, none of which were assembled in any adequate form. The problem was documented. The solution was understood. The action was insufficient. This gap between what the science said and what was done repeated the pattern that runs through the entire history of lead in the 20th century. The knowledge precedes the action by years, by decades. The gap is filled by the resistance of industries whose profits depend on inaction, by the political fragility of regulations that impose costs on powerful constituencies, and by the simple, grinding difficulty of mobilizing public institutions to address a harm that is invisible, chronic, and distributed across millions of individual lives rather than concentrated in a single dramatic event. By the end of the 1980s, the phasing out of leaded petrol was producing measurable improvements in the blood lead levels of the American population. The 78% decline between 1976 and 1991 was a genuine public health achievement, perhaps the most significant environmental health victory of the 20th century. But the paint remained, and the soil in the roadsides and the urban gardens and the yards of the older housing retained the lead that decades of vehicle exhaust had deposited in it. In 1991, Louis Sullivan, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, described childhood lead poisoning as the #1 environmental health threat to children in the United States. It was an acknowledgement that carried the weight of everything that had preceded it. The century of documented harm, the delayed bans, the industry campaigns, the children who had grown up in houses where the dust was faintly, persistently sweet, and no one had known exactly what that sweetness was doing. The CDC estimates published in 2013 found that more than 500,000 American children between the ages of 1 and 5 still had blood lead levels high enough to be considered dangerous. Not the levels of the mid-century, when leaded petrol was at its peak and lead paint was being freshly applied to the walls of new homes, but high enough, dangerous enough, in a country that had been documenting the hazard since at least the early years of the 20th century. The children those numbers represented were not statistical abstractions. They were children in old houses, in cities where the housing stock had not been remediated, in communities that lacked the resources to force the issue or the political power to demand adequate response. They were children sitting on floors where decades-old dust had settled, children whose blood, if someone tested it, and in many cases no one did test it, would settled. In the oldest houses, 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 unsettled, in the oldest houses, in the cheapest neighborhoods, in the places where the remediation money never quite arrived, and where the political will to compel landlords or governments to act was perpetually deferred. This is not a natural distribution of harm. It is a distribution that was shaped over decades by housing policy and economic inequality, and the specific history of who was allowed to move into newer housing and who was confined to the oldest. The lead followed those lines. It always had. Needleman understood this. Patterson had understood it. The physicians in Brisbane had understood it in 1897. The painters whose hands had trembled in the 17th century had understood it in the only way available to them, through the direct testimony of their own bodies. The knowledge had always been there. It moved through history like something trying to be heard. And slowly, imperfectly, with a lag that will always be counted as one of the great failures of 20th century public health, it was heard. But hearing and acting are different things, and the legacy of the lead, in the soil, in the walls, in the bodies of the generation that grew up breathing the mid-century air, would not dissolve with the hearing. It would remain. In the earth and in the bone, in the quiet counterfactual of what might have been, in the aggregate of all the small diminishments that were accepted as ordinary because no one could see the metal that had caused them. The final reckoning with that legacy is not complete. It may not be complete for decades more, but its shape, at least, is now fully visible. And that visibility, that capacity to see the harm clearly, to name it, to measure it, to trace its path from the ancient Roman pipe to the cracked windowsill of a Baltimore row house, is itself a kind of progress. Not enough, but not nothing. In August of 2021, the last country on Earth still selling leaded petrol for road vehicles quietly removed it from its forecourts. That country was Algeria. The date was sometime in mid-August, when the final reserves of leaded fuel were exhausted and not replenished. There was no ceremony, no declaration, no international press conference to mark the end of a century that had begun in a laboratory in Dayton, Ohio, in December 1921, when a young engineer had added a compound of lead to a single-cylinder test engine and listened to the knock disappear. 100 years, very nearly to the month. 100 years from the first commercial sale of ethyl gasoline to the last pump running dry in a North African city. 100 years during which the air of the inhabited world had carried something it had never carried before in the entirety of human history. The combustion products of tetraethyl lead, dispersed in exhaust, settling on every surface, entering every lung. It is worth sitting with that span of time for a moment, in the quiet of wherever you are tonight. 100 years. There are people alive today whose grandparents were born before leaded petrol existed, and who will live to see a world in which it is gone. The contamination of the 20th century atmosphere with industrial lead is not an ancient fact or a distant abstraction. It is within living memory. It happened in the lifetimes of people whose children are still alive, and its consequences are not yet fully resolved. The 1986 prohibition on tetraethyl lead in American road fuel, the final regulatory step that had been building since the EPA's first phase-out regulations in 1973, produced measurable results almost immediately. The blood lead levels of Americans, already falling through the late 1970s and early 1980s as the petrol phase-out progressed, continued their decline through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. By 1991, the average blood lead concentration of an American child had dropped by nearly 80% compared to the peak of the leaded petrol era. 80%. The number deserves to be stated plainly, without qualification, because it is one of the most significant demonstrations in the history of environmental medicine of what happens when a source of contamination is removed. The lead had entered the atmosphere through the exhaust of cars. When cars stopped producing that exhaust, the lead in the atmosphere fell. When the lead in the atmosphere fell, the lead in the blood of the people breathing that atmosphere fell with it. The chain of causation was direct, measurable, and, in retrospect, exactly what Clair Patterson had predicted from his ice cores in 1965. The petrol ban worked. This is important to understand, not merely as a historical fact, but as a template. The lead had been placed in the environment by a specific, identifiable human decision made in the early 1920s. It was removed from the environment by a series of specific, identifiable regulatory decisions made 50 years later. Between the first decision and the last, something enormous happened to the health of the global population. When the last decision was finally implemented, something measurable and positive happened in response. Cause-effect intervention result. The mechanism was not mysterious, but the petrol was only one source, and the removal of one source does not remove the legacy of what that source deposited over half a century. Lead does not degrade. It does not break down into something harmless over time. It does not evaporate or dissolve or metabolize into a benign compound. It accumulates. In soil, in bone, in the layered sediments of riverbeds, in the paint of old walls, in the settled dust of houses that have not been cleaned in the particular way that removes lead dust effectively. Lead deposited on the soil of a roadside verge in 1965 is still in that soil today. It has moved slowly through rainfall and root systems and the ordinary processes of soil chemistry, but it has not gone. It is there. Approximately 29 million American housing units, as of the most recent CDC estimates, contain lead-based paint hazards, deteriorating paint, lead-contaminated dust, or lead-contaminated soil associated with the structure. Of those, approximately 2.6 million are home to young children. This is not a historical statistic. It is a current one. The hazard is not past tense. It is present tense in the homes of children who were born this decade, in houses built in the decades when lead paint was the standard and remediation was not. In 2014, the city of Flint, Michigan, changed its municipal water source from Lake Huron to the Flint River as a cost-cutting measure, while a new pipeline was being constructed. The Flint River water was more corrosive than the Lake Huron water it replaced. It corroded the old lead service lines that connected the municipal mains to residential properties. Lines that had been installed decades earlier when lead pipe was standard, and that had been protected from leaching into the water supply by a mineral coating that the corrosive Flint River water stripped away. Lead entered the drinking water of Flint. For months, officials at the city and state level insisted the water was safe. Residents, many of them low income, predominantly black, reported the water tasted wrong, looked wrong, was causing rashes and hair loss. They were dismissed. Their concerns were characterized as overreaction. The regulatory frameworks that should have detected the problem failed, in the particular way that regulatory frameworks tend to fail when the community affected lacks political power. A pediatrician named Mona Hanna Atisha tested the blood lead levels of children in Flint before and after the water source change. The results showed a significant increase. She published her findings. She was initially dismissed by state officials who questioned her data. She was right, and the officials were wrong, and eventually this became undeniable. The crisis in Flint became a national story, a modern instance of a very old pattern playing out in real time in front of a watching country. The Flint water crisis was not caused by ignorance. It was caused by choices, by the decision to use a corrosive water source, by the decision not to add anti-corrosion treatment to the water, a standard and inexpensive precaution, by the decision, repeated over months, to dismiss the concerns of the people who were most directly affected. It was, in its essential structure, the same story as the Bayway workers in 1924 and the Brisbane children in 1897 and the painters of 17th century Europe whose trembling hands were attributed to artistic temperament rather than occupational poisoning. The knowledge was present, the action was withheld. A study published in 2022 estimated that more than half of the current population of the United States, people alive and living today, was exposed to elevated levels of lead in early childhood during the decades when leaded petrol was at or near its peak and lead paint was still present in the majority of the nation's housing stock. More than half. This is not a small or marginal figure. It is a description of an exposure that was, for several decades of the 20th century, simply the ordinary condition of American childhood. Not an accident, not an anomaly. The baseline. What the research on low-level lead exposure consistently finds is that the damage is cognitive, behavioral, and neurological, and that it is real even at levels far below those associated with any clinical diagnosis of poisoning. IQ reductions, increased impulsivity, reduced capacity for sustained attention. These effects, distributed across a population half the size of a nation, are expressed not as individual tragedies that can be pointed to and named, but as a statistical shift in the aggregate distribution of human capacity. A slight elevation of the average in one direction, a slight compression in another. Invisible in any individual life, vast in its collective dimensions. The economists who have attempted to quantify the cost of this exposure estimate the annual loss to the American economy from childhood lead poisoning in reduced educational attainment, reduced lifetime earnings, increased healthcare costs, increased costs to the criminal justice system at approximately $80 billion per year. Across the decades during which the exposure was at its height, the accumulated cost is a figure that resists easy comprehension. None of this can be recovered. It is not possible to go back and give the children of the 1950s and 1960s the blood lead levels they should have had. It is not possible to restore the cognitive capacity that was quietly diminished by the metal in the air they breathed and the dust they played in and the water they drank. The damage is fixed in the past. The people who sustained it are the people they became, in a world in which that is simply who they were, with no awareness, in most cases, of what might have been different. What can be recovered, what has in measurable ways already been recovered, is the future. Blood lead levels in American children have fallen dramatically since the peak of the leaded petrol era. The current generation of children is growing up in air that contains, by any historical measure, extraordinarily little lead compared to the mid-20th century. The 80% decline between 1976 and 1991 continued through subsequent decades as the remaining sources of large-scale exposure were progressively reduced. The average blood lead level of an American child today is a fraction of what it was when Clair Patterson was writing his 1965 paper in horror at what the ice cores had shown him. This matters. The improvement is real. It is documented. It is the direct consequence of decisions made by regulators and scientists and advocates, and eventually legislators. People who chose to act on the evidence even when the industries whose profits depended on inaction resisted at every step. The story of lead is, among other things, a story about the relationship between knowledge and action, between the existence of evidence and the willingness to act on it, between the testimony of the body, the trembling hand, the convulsing worker, the child who cannot quite keep up in school, and the institutional capacity to hear that testimony and respond with something more than further study. The gap between those things has been, throughout this story, the place where the harm accumulates. It accumulated in Rome, where Galen wrote that lead pipe water was unfit for drinking and the pipes stayed in the ground. It accumulated in the paint factories of the 18th and 19th centuries, where the painter's palsy was noted and named and attributed to almost anything other than the substance the painters worked with every day. It accumulated across the 50 years between Midgley's press conference and the EPA's phase-out regulations, while the cars ran and the exhaust rose and the children on the pavements beside the traffic breathed what the century had placed in the air. The gap is not inevitable. It is not a feature of human nature, permanent and unalterable. The gap closes when the evidence becomes undeniable, when the advocates are persistent enough, when the political moment aligns with the scientific consensus. It closed for leaded petrol. It closed, finally, for residential lead paint. It has not closed completely for the remediation of the 29 million housing units still carrying the legacy of the old paint in their walls. But it is smaller than it was. This is the shape of the reckoning as it stands tonight. Not complete, not clean, not the satisfying resolution of a story that has reached its proper end. The lead is still in the soil of old roadsides, still in the paint of old walls, still in the accumulated sediment of a century of decisions made when the cost of those decisions was not counted in the people who would pay it. But the direction has changed. The air is cleaner. The blood of children is cleaner. The ice that forms today over Greenland carries less lead than the ice that formed in 1965, when Patterson first read the cause and understood what he was seeing. The trajectory of the contamination has reversed. Slowly, partially, with all the unevenness that large-scale environmental remediation involves, but reversed. Think again of that Roman pipe beneath the streets of an empire that no longer exists. Grey and soft and obliging, shaped by hands that trusted it because it was useful and because there was nothing else readily available, and because the harm it did was slow and quiet and too easily attributed to other things. We are not Rome. We have the instruments now to measure what the body carries. We have the epidemiology to trace the path from source to blood to outcome. We have, if not the complete political will, at least the scientific vocabulary to name what we are looking at. The pipe is still in the earth in some places. So is the paint. So is the soil along the old highways. But we know they are there. We know what they carry. And knowing, slowly, imperfectly, with all the resistance that knowledge always meets when it threatens the comfortable and the profitable, is where everything begins. Good night.